Our next panel is the education panel, and it's moderated by Ileana Costea. Ileana has worked with us a tremendous amount with the planning committee. She's a CSUN, I forget your title, Director of Manufacturing Services.
I was the chair of the Manufacturing Systems Engineering and Management, and we have a very large management program, especially a graduate management program.
I'll give it over to Ileana.
Thank you very much. And I really want to appreciate that you joined this event where CSUN is a partner, and I'm part of the system of CSUN. So chairing the educational panel, I would like to start with a very pleasant surprise I found yesterday night when I met a student who is a high school student and who goes to El Camino College. And I asked the student, well, what did you learn? And I got this beautiful answer. I learned about Deming's concepts, which I did not know very much, almost anything, but I also learned how to change my life. I learned about PSDA. I learned about how to judge the intrinsic and extrinsic. So he learned about how to change his life. Isn't that beautiful? Well, there were many more questions for the business panel, and less questions, just one, good to have one, for the educational panel. But before we go to that question, I'm going to briefly introduce the speakers whom you know already. And I'll make a general first introduction. These are people who are changing or trying to change with success the educational system. And this morning we heard that we are all really stuck in our past. We are really stuck in the old educational system. Not that we are bad educators, but we as educators kind of use the old way in which we were educated. And here you have a panel who tries to change that. And we have been told, for instance, that a 5-year-old is seeing things and acting more creatively. I don't know if you watched the design experiment with the marshmallow and the spaghetti, and the 5-year-old, the 7-year-old will be much more creative than a person who went to school, right? And if you read Saint-Exupéry's The Prince, you know that that's absolutely true. Why? And Deming comes with these answers. A 5-year-old has not gone through the old school, has not been inhibited. He is getting out of fear. And these people have, each of them has presented an aspect. Like, for instance, Monta Akin and Kendra Shaffer, they talk about how they can restructure the K-12 system. Then we have somebody who said, Doug Stilwell, who said, we must have trust. Trust changes everything. Think about pessimistic people. Bad things happen to them all the time. They don't have trust. It's not a magic, it's not a miracle. Then we have David Langford, who is also an actor in a PBS movie. And the actor shows how he was able to change the only public boarding school in Alaska educational system. With that being, did I miss somebody? Yes, I missed somebody who yesterday made a wonderful presentation, Andrea Gabor. And she started before her presentation to say, I did not know about Deming many years ago. And all of a sudden, I met some situation in which I learned about him, and it transformed me. And now she wrote a book. She's working on another book. So here is the panel, and I'm going to shoot with a question. The question says, within the Deming model, students, we have two questions. Within the Deming model, students guide their learning at their own rate. Question, how does a student complete the AG requirements the university require in order to be admitted? That's the question, not mine. 3 questions, very good.
That might be a better question for David in terms of a system that he was able to work outside of the system. We were still within a system that requires grades, GPA, salutatorian, et cetera. There are ways that we can get around that to some degree, but certainly we still operate trying to change and sometimes changing successfully within that system.
Well, you can't begin to optimize learning in the system unless you begin to think like that. And as soon as you start to release people, the current system, there's a mismatch. Either people aren't ready for the level of learning, or the level of learning is moving faster than they're ready for. And so we find this equilibrium that, okay, so that if the teacher's going to manage that, they're going to move at a certain pace. And so you have advanced kids that are bored, and you have kids that are frustrated that because it's going too fast. And so teachers are being taught today to learn how to try to manage that. Well, it's pretty much impossible. But when you go back to the individual and you actually teach students how to manage their own pace, then the learning is just in time. They get what they need at the pace they need to get it. And when you think like that, then the whole world begins to change. So, for instance, in high school, most of you went through Algebra 1 and then Geometry and then Algebra 2. But what if we got the system out of the way and people could actually move at their own pace? So basically, you just have math, and in that math class, people are taught to teach themselves and to work with their peers, to get coached and to move as quickly as possible. And what would happen then? Well, we discovered that people could jump almost 2 grade levels every 6 months when the system wasn't in their way. And so we all grew up in the Carnegie unit system, where whether you get it or not, you're going to have to sit there for a whole semester or a year, because it's all about seat time, it's not about learning. So when you follow Deming's principles and you actually worry about the learning process, is learning really meaningful and relevant to people? Are people allowed to move at their own pace? And then you create a system around that that allows that to happen. You see extraordinary things happen. Students that you thought before were not capable, we tend to call them SD, they're systems disabled. System's not allowing them to be motivated and move forward. So.
And I would say it gets more difficult the higher you go up in the pre-K-12 system. There are more constraints from the outside on that. And sometimes you have to look for small successes. For example, within the last couple of years, we have allowed students the option, you may choose for us to submit with your transcript a ranking, a class ranking, or you may choose not to. If your ranking is not very high, you are served much better to have a holistic review by a university or a college. And so trying to educate our students on the best path for them for their next step.
One of the pieces we consider is what are the systems as a K-12 public educational institution with whom we interface, and that's obviously post-secondary. And so as Monta was talking, it made me think about class rank. In Iowa, in order to get into the region institutions, typically the class rank needs to be above 50, above the 50%. And some school districts understand the fallacy of what class ranking can mean. And so they are saying, we are no longer going to provide that information to the region institutions. Well, enough of the larger school districts have gone that way that the region institutions have changed some of their policy. So sometimes it's a matter of helping other systems with whom we interact to change the way they work that allows us to change the way that we work. And that doesn't happen often very easily, because so often we don't talk to one another. We think about, K-12 education, and we forget about the post-secondary and what leverage we may have in that. So conversations with those organizations, conversations through our legislature to help impact policy is really a high leverage opportunity for us that allows us to do more of what we know is better in terms of actual authentic learning for students.
Everybody in Urbandale's above 50% now, aren't they?
Just about.
Well, from one question, thank you so much, panel. From one question, we have 5. So that's good, that's good. Relating to the fact that the system of education goes even beyond the borders of the walls of the school, we have a question from, I assume, a parent or a member of the community who says, what can we as parents and members of the community do to support your, I would put in parentheses my words, Deming type efforts?
Just do whatever we say.
Anyone else?
Well,
Sure, please, Andrea.
You know, I've spent a lot of time looking at a variety of different schools, and many of the schools that I've looked up are very low-income schools because even though the education reform movement says that the entire American school system is failing, it's really primarily failing low-income kids. And one of the biggest problems with low-income kids, or schools with a lot of low-income kids, is this perception that there's not enough parent involvement. One of the things that that schools that are entering into this idea of systems thinking are doing is wherever they can, they really try to reach out to parents as a very important part of the school constituency, with varying degrees of success. But the sort of systems thinking schools really make an effort to do that. And you know, in my talk, I very deliberately didn't talk about Leander because at the very least it would have been silly, if not insulting, for me to talk about what I saw at Leander after just one visit. So I talked about schools that don't explicitly follow the Deming model, but that are very congruent with it. And I think that there's a lot of need out there, and there's a real opportunity for an institution like the Deming Institute to reach out to, and I'm not sure how you do it, but to reach out to these organizations that I think would be very receptive to the kind of thinking that goes on here, and you know, help them move forward.
well, I can comment on that because I have 5 children, and they've all gone through the school system where we live. And at first it was an extremely frustrating process because even knowing what I know and going and trying to volunteer information, it didn't work. They didn't know that they needed anything. And from my children's standpoint, it soon evolved as my children understood the philosophy more. It became actually a great source for us to have conversations. So we'd sit at the dinner table in the evening and they'd say, "Dad, you'll never guess what happened today." And we'd have this great discussion about systems thinking and what should have happened. And they actually started looking for examples about what could have had happened, et cetera. And then as a parent, I would just look for opportunities, whether that's a principal, a teacher, or a superintendent, or where you can sit down and kind of coach yourself into asking the right questions and look for that fertile ground where, okay, this person's open to that. My oldest daughter, when we first moved to Montana, had a teacher that suddenly just started asking a few questions like, you know, why are you doing that? And where does that come from? And things like that. And she started really getting involved. And I started training her more. And she got to where she was really doing amazing stuff inside a system that just didn't get it. And so I thought I'd really help her out. And so I paid for her to go down to the conference in Leander, Texas, and give a little presentation at their conference about what she was doing, and Monta hired her. So.
Well,
was just thinking of, in Leander, we have so many opportunities to work with parents and offer kind of a transparent type of relationship. And in doing that, what we've done is we use the tools in a lot of different ways so that we're basically educating the community that we exist in to be more open and look for those things and ask the questions of why. And so I think we've started to develop a community who are right on top of things. You know, they're right there at the table with us, asking us questions and wanting us to go through processes and look at systems. And we do that when we're opening new schools and the rezoning process that we go through. And so I think we've started to embed use of those tools in the work we do with our community, which I think is part of what spreads the culture.
Now thank you so much. Now, you, please.
I think it's also incumbent upon us as educators to remember that, and we're really in our 5th year of trying to transform our district in Urbandale, Iowa. But one of the things that I think is incumbent upon us as educators is to remember that these aren't our kids, that the kids belong to the parents. And parents will have questions. They'll wonder, why are you experimenting on my kids? What I grew up with, and while we could argue maybe it wasn't the best, it didn't bring about the same amount of uncertainty as what maybe you're talking about. So I think we have to be sensitive to that as educators, to know that the vast majority of people, including ourselves, grew up in a system. And to understand that as we try to improve the system, that improvement requires change. And what some parents will assume is that you are experimenting on my children. And while you have in Leander 30,000 children, in Urbandale we have 4,000 children, as a parent I'm worried about that one. And so I think it's our responsibility, as you mentioned, to make sure that we're helping parents to understand and understanding where they are at first. Understanding their current reality is likely filled with some fear, because what had worked for them, we're saying, doesn't really work anymore. And so that is a current reality we have to understand. And so that communication, and mainly most of it, should likely be listening. Help me to understand your fear. Please be specific. Don't hold back any punches. Let us know so that we can respond appropriately. As an educator and also as a parent, I see the educational system from 2 different perspectives. One is you're messing around with my children. 2, we really think we know as an educator what's best for kids and for learning. So it's a gap that we have to continue to bridge until we get enough impetus and until we've reached that tipping point where this is the way we do education generally. There will always be questions, and we need to respect those questions that parents have for their children.
Thank you very much. Now the next question kind of returns to the bridge between instructors, teachers, and children. And I want to mention to you that in a video, a talk between Russell Ackoff and Deming, Dr. Deming says, it's very bad to ask questions where a student should answer A, B, C, D. It's very bad to ask questions where the student is expected to just tell you what you, as an asker, expect, because that cuts creativity. And the student just says what it learned, but it did not really understand. So the question comes, please talk more about intrinsic motivation, your views about homework.
Personally or professionally?
Right.
I can really address that. So there's been studies done on that, and Alfie Kahn wrote a book called The Homework Myth. So if you're really interested in that, you should read that. But he did international studies and tried to find out those countries that gave the most homework and those that did. And the ones that give the most homework have the lowest performance rates, and the ones that don't give homework have just the opposite. So especially in America, homework is often used as punishment. You know, you screwed around and you didn't do stuff, so now you got 2 hours of homework. And then it's pushed off on parents at home to try to help their kids. And usually by about 4th grade, my children all learned, don't have dad help you with your homework because you'll just get it wrong. So, because I don't know the context of what's going on in the classroom, the teacher, et cetera. So, you know, I try to teach people continually to improve the process significantly in the school, where kids are getting expert coaching from a teacher and mentoring and getting, you know, advice that they need at that level, and not try to push it off on parents who are not trained to do that well. And also, the whole world's changed. Any of you that have children know that, you know, kids they're in soccer and they got, you know, music practice and they got this and they got this and they get that. And I get really upset when my son doesn't get home till 6 or 7 o'clock at night, and then he's got 2 hours of homework, and I never get to see him. I never get to work on our relationship or do things because the system is continually working that through. So we've got many schools where they pretty much did away with the idea of homework. One of them was in Australia, and I went back down there, and the parents wanted to meet with me. I thought, oh no, you know, we're gonna have a big riot or something. But there was only 3 of them, so it's clearly special cause behavior. And the one father that was just really upset because he said, you know, this used to be my time. I'm a math engineer, and I used to love doing my son's homework with him and working. He was upset, and now he doesn't have any homework. So I said, yeah, we're doing our job, you know.
I would piggyback on what David said, is that parents do demand homework. Students not so much, but parents demand homework. And as we started to ask why is it the parents want homework, especially in early grades, I think what they want is a conversation and a connection with their child's learning. So we have talked about some system-wide things in terms of limiting the amount of homework, talking about the homework, but I think we've made the most improvements in talking about what is really a good conversation, what really is a good conversation for parents and students to be having about their learning. And it's usually not the content specifically of let's go and practice these problems. And as a former speaker said, you look for those fertile grounds, and to make changes, you have to continue to be around to make improvements. That's not something right now in our system that I think we would with 36,000 parents be able to survive saying no homework. So we have chosen to look at how can we improve the conversations going on around that, particularly in the earlier grades.
Well, many schools have quotas for homework. You must have 10 minutes of homework for every grade level you are. So by 7th grade, you have 70 minutes of homework at night. It's just ridiculous. And so teachers dream up stuff. You know, I got to get my homework in, and so okay, let's have them do this thing. So homework's useful if it's the meaning network of people. So if you're sick, well, okay, you were probably behind and you have some homework. Let's say you didn't use your time wisely in class, and so you're a bit behind. You would have some homework. Let's say that the project is pretty complex, and maybe you need to get multiple people together in a different environment to be able to work together, because you can't get all those people within the containing system. So that would make sense. So if it makes sense, you'll get people to do it at a very high level. But if they just feel like it's just being signed arbitrarily, then you run into the situation where teachers want to start tracking it, and then they want to start punishing people for that don't get it, and, you know, forcing the compliance.
Anyone?
You mentioned at the beginning of the question something about student and teacher relationships. And if we can help train teachers and help them to understand that they're partners in their students' learning, that's a big hurdle. It's just like the conversation I had one night with our Board of Education, and I sometimes say things I probably shouldn't, but I said, you know, we're all sitting around this table. If we strip away all of our titles, we're really here interested in student learning. You have a role, I have a role. And if we do the same with teachers and students, say they're really interested, we want them to be interested in student learning. The teacher has a role, the student has a role. And as they consider those roles, they might better ask the questions, what will it take for us to help that learning to occur? sometime if it's very meaningful work that has to be done outside of schools, David said, it becomes a natural motivator. There's an intrinsic motivation to it because you want to learn. But if it's something that we're doing, and as David mentioned, not based on a quota of time that we need to fit, of course we're going to have issues. And then that issue then spills into the classroom. Kids don't have their homework done. What do we do about that? Do we include homework in the grade? What does homework mean in terms of a grade? There's so many questions that come up that as we really stop to think about it, I think, David, maybe you said this once, it makes sense until you think about it. And that sometimes is the case with homework. So if we have relationships established between teachers and their students, my hope is that they'll come to the notion that if we assign something, it must be meaningful for kids, meaningful for them, not trying to help them create what it means for an adult, but what does it mean to have meaningful work for an 8-year-old, for a 12-year-old, for a 14-year-old? It's very different. And so that's why that feedback piece is important for teachers to understand what is meaningful for students that will help them to learn. But so fundamental is that relationship as partners between teachers and students.
Briefly, we did talk a lot about the intrinsic, and we could talk about that forever. Just as parents have an expectation of what school looks like, teachers come with an archetype almost of what school looks like, and it does begin with stickers in the treasure box in kindergarten. That is very hard to work against. So we showed an example of a PDSA. We try and provide teachers with other tools that can provide them ways to develop the intrinsic motivation. You can't yank something out of someone's hands without giving them something, so it is a slow process, but coaching them on more effective ways that can help them realize that intrinsic reward system is not only not necessary, it can be harmful in some ways, but that is a slow process.
I'd like to just say one word about homework as a college professor. So if you look at K through 12, beyond K through 12, and also at the culture, we're graduating a lot of kids partly because of social media and all sorts of other cultural factors, kids who don't read, for example. I get a lot of college kids, they're bright, but they don't know how to read a newspaper. Their knowledge of literature, what I would consider to be basic knowledge of literature, is very thin. I'm not going to get into a blame game of, why that is, but we live in a world where I think homework, however you define it, is a reality, okay? I don't know I challenge anyone in this room who doesn't need to do homework at some point to get through their job, either at work or as a parent, et cetera. So maybe it's a definitional thing. I'm not talking about worksheets and things like that, but I don't know how is the school day long enough for kids to be able to read the newspaper, to read a novel, to do the kind of extra enriching work that I think every citizen and high school graduate, certainly college graduate, needs. So maybe we need to call it something different, and maybe we need to separate that out from the worksheets and other things that may not be meaningful. But I think certainly, I don't know how you define it, but certainly expecting students to do that reading that I don't think is realistic to do in class is really important.
Well, I try to teach teachers to stop using the word work. So if you just replace work with learning, so do we have any home learning? Well, I don't know, do you? Depends. Are you so interested in this that you want to go home and do some deeper knowledge, and is it necessary, and try to get people to think like that? But this whole idea of work in school is really a 20th century paradigm that we're still bringing into the 21st century, when we want people to be intrinsically motivated, be creative, be able to function at a much higher level than just do what I say when I do it, and if you don't, I'm just going to make your life so darn miserable you wish you would have. So
Well, it's very interesting. You talked about motivation, and rather than giving direct rewards, giving the inspirational motivation, maybe we should call homework fun learning, right? Because students, be they graduate or undergraduate, they like to have fun. And guess what? They sometimes do have fun when they design a robot or when they do something where they are really interested in. And related to motivation and rewards, there is another question. Simple, short, and to the point. What is the feeling on grades?
What is the feeling on grades? I think we all know from Deming's perspective, right? If there's something that is harder to attack than homework, it would certainly be grades. In the years that we have been working on applying the philosophy, learning from it, we have eliminated grades up to grade 3. That's a long haul over time. And that had to do with educating teachers, looking at research, trying it on a small scale, bringing back, and so it is a long process. I don't quite have the vision, again, to seeing the constraints outside our system that at high school that we could begin to see that in my tenure anyway. But it is one of those archetypes of education that is very difficult to do. Now, on the other hand, taking away grades, I think we have developed better systems, parallel systems that that parents see give them more feedback than a simple letter grade or a number. And for example, just to show you that kids do understand that, a colleague of mine, her son just went into 4th grade and has a more traditional report card, got his first report card and looked at it, and he looked at it and he said, well, that's no good, that doesn't tell me anything. So kids that have been, if we can gradually show kids that what those other means of feedback provide them, then I think that we can very gradually change that system.
Well, I teach teachers all the time, you're caught within a system. You can't just stop giving grades tomorrow and keep your job because the system won't allow it. And so what do? You have to work within that. So first time I went to a Deming seminar, 1986, I thought, stupid old man, he doesn't really understand the real world. We have grades around here and this is what we do in our system. And so I went back and ran my own experiment. I had an AP class, had 6 kids in it. I looked at them, I thought, these kids are going to do well no matter what I do to them. And so I sat down and started having a conversation. I said, why are we here? And they said to get good grades. And I said, okay, y'all got good grades. And they said, prove it. And so I got the grade book out, put all A's down the column. And then I said, now why are we here? That took about 3 days of discussing and talking about that, and it came down to, I guess we're here to learn the most we can possible. So we pretty much did the kinds of things we did before, and I kind of kept the scores on the side just kind of to see, what was happening. Because my theory was if I don't do this, they're just not going to do anything. Nothing will happen. And just the opposite happened. We had twice as much learning going on at a higher rate, more discussions, more depth, all kinds of things. But when I looked at the scores at the end, it was pretty much what I'd had in years past. So I was kind of stumped because, my theory was, I'm going to get such better scores on things. And then I had to think about it. Well, sort of like performance appraisals, why am I doing this? I'm spending all this time calculating scores, adding things up, calculating to the 100th degree of a point for what? Nothing changed, see? So, just stop doing it. The other thing I tell teachers is, the first step in that process of eliminating grades is to stop emphasizing it. So when people say, why are we doing this? The first thing out of your mouth should not be because it's on the test on Friday or you're going to fail. The first thing out of your mouth should be, okay, let's talk about that. Why would you need to know this, and how is it going to affect your future, and where's the meaning in it for you, see? And that creates a whole different context. And the third thing I'd say is, I went to my principal and I said, is there any state law that says that all my students can't get A's? And he kind of laughed at me. No, there's no state law like that. So it is possible that all of my students could get an A, yes. Well, when I turned in my grades and I had 133 A's out of 135, within 10 minutes, he was in my room. What are you doing? I changed the system and I got a different result. The research on grading is that the only kids motivated by grading systems are the ones getting good grades. That's about 5 to 10% of the population. All others, 90% of the population, see it as a demotivator. So if the system's continually harping on grades as a way to try to motivate people, it's just a vicious circle. It's never going to go anywhere. So
I would reiterate what David said, or to piggyback on that. When we talk about the other grade levels beyond grade 3, it is looking at other ways to de-emphasize grade, using matrices, having the emphasis be on improvement. Where are you? What did you learn? Having students set their own goals and track their own progress. So keeping the attention on that as much as you can, and getting out of that victim mode that a teacher gave me a grade, that at least if they can see a system that results in a grade, then they're well aware of it all along, but it's not something that you have to talk about constantly.
it's not a weapon.
Right, right.
It's not a cause, right?
One of the challenges with grades is that if you were to come to Urbandale High School and ask our roughly 100 teachers who work there what an A means, you probably get 100 different answers. So there's no consistency about what that means. If you were to ask parents what grades mean, we have some comfort in that because that's the system we've experienced, but likely they couldn't tell you the same thing other than, well, it means my child scored 94% or above on this test or in this class, but we don't talk about what it means in terms of learning. And because we've trained teachers in a certain system to work a certain way, they probably don't know that either. So it gets at, who are we going to blame? Well, really the teachers aren't to blame, it's a system they grew up in. So it's incumbent upon us as leaders to help as we ask teachers to make those very same connections with their students, ask the questions, why, what does it mean? It's incumbent upon us as school leaders to ask the very same questions to challenge the paradigms of our teachers. And I think when push comes to shove, the vast majority will come to that same conclusion that the grades mean very little. We'll have some that will hang on to it, that want to keep one foot in the old system while keeping another foot in the current system. But it's really important for us to help teachers to understand what grades do and don't mean, the negative impact they can have upon kids, and ultimately the negative impact they can have upon learning. The next step in that process is to have that same conversation with parents who grew up in that system and feel a sense of comfort, or even on standardized tests. We think we know what that means, but if you probably were to ask honestly parents, what does that mean in terms of your children's learning? They really don't know. And that is a fallacy of the system. So I go back to what Dr. Deming said, I think a lot. I've never heard him, but things I've read is it always begins with leadership. And what is leadership doing to help influence people's thinking that will lay the pathway for new patterns? We talked earlier about new patterns in our brains, but new patterns in this socio-cultural system that allows for different things to happen. That's a key part that our teachers alone can't do, and our teachers alone probably aren't aware of. So as leaders, whatever role we're in, whether it's we're doing some consulting, we're working at the collegiate level, what are we doing to help change people's thinking about what grades mean and how they can actually be harmful to a great majority of the students?
Well,
I just want one more thought is that the research on this from a brain research standpoint and organizationally too is crystal clear. The higher the extrinsic motivator, the lower the learning. Not only the lower the learning, the lower the connection to your fellow man, because you got to get the grade, and so you can't cooperate with other people to do things. And if you don't remember anything else, just remember that. It's the same in any business. The more that you emphasize the extrinsic motivator, pay for performance, things like that, people are going to they'll work for that, and what they'll remember is all the mechanisms they used to get that. So it's the same way in the school. They'll remember all the mechanisms they used to get the A, but they don't remember the material that they had to learn to get the A. So they learn strategies, and they become very, very efficient at that. But if you take those very same kids and put them in a role where they have to think, they struggle mightily.
And I would add, you know, we're often, as educators said, follow the business model, do what businesses do. And I've never worked outside of education, so I don't really know what that is. But a friend of mine who works for an insurance company talks about their reward system they have. So if you have the highest amount of sales, right, it's trying to get people to compete. If you have the highest amount of sales, you win this trip to Hawaii, as an example. And I said, well, tell me more about that. I said, do you find it really ups the level of everyone's work? He said, no, in fact, it's usually the same people that win it every year. And we don't see any growth in total sales. So we take that to the same piece in education. We can raise those standards, and you may have whoever it is blows the top off of something, but our goal is not to produce just one person in the system who is excellent. Our goal is to produce every child who's going to be excellent. And here's the moral part of that. How could I, as superintendent of schools in Urbandale, look at all of the parents and point to some of them and say, we're not going to make your child excellent? How could I do that? And so I know the reality is some won't. But I can't go into it saying that I'm going to create a system that's only going to allow some of you to be excellent. So there is not only the whole economic piece behind education, but there's a moral piece behind it in terms of what we do to kids that ultimately disincentivizes them to perform. And that is in the form of grades, which, as David mentioned, is not a great way to incentivize children who don't perform well within the current system.
And most teachers are operating within a grading system. Talking about looking for fertile ground, when we began to, decades ago, truly began to understand and realized how important it was to drive out fear and to build trust, we asked focus groups of teachers, so what's the biggest source of fear in the system? So we may not even know about it. And to a person, it was the appraisal system. And at that time, it was, you could get several $1,000s if you got those extra points. And even those, we were talking to some of those people that got those extra points, you could see the lack of collaboration that happened. They started doing dog and pony shows, of course, for evaluations. But that was something we were naive enough to say, well, maybe we can do away with it. So we wrote to the commissioner of the state and said, we don't want to do those. We would like to do something else. And he said, okay. And so that was something with one fell swoop we were actually able to change. Sometimes you can change things quickly, and sometimes you have to plod along.
We have 1 more minute, I've been told. Your answers were so great that you stimulated the growth of questions number. So, and I would like to ask one last question, and you have to answer, one of you should answer, and then we have to stop to give the time to the next speaker, happens to be the provost of my university, and I have to be very precise with time. So the next question, I will put 2 questions in one, and it really deals with the 21st century and changing the paradigm of the teachers. First question, what is school going to look like when we'll have the Khan Academy, massive open online curriculums, Ron Paul curriculum, resources, the internet, I'm jumping over, and then what do you think about the flipped class? Concepts are delivered online using screen capture technology and so on. So there we are with a total shift of paradigm.
I will answer that. That is, if we don't do something like learn from the teachers of Deming, it's going to look exactly like it does now. Just because you have a flipped classroom, you can have really boring extrinsically motivated experiences in that way. So none of those shifts in and of themselves are going to make a difference if you don't change the system and the structure.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ileana and
very much.
panelists.
I,
Okay.
I would end by saying the panel was so good, the speakers were so good, there are so many questions. Come to the next Deming seminar and you will get your answers.